Good evening, and welcome to a podcast in our series titled Past, Present, and Future Perspectives on Mental Health in the Black Community. This initiative consists of a series of podcasts, forums, and healing circles over a 6-month period that seek to expose the negative stigma associated with mental health, encourage open and honest discussions amongst men, women, and youth, and provide tangible solutions towards healing and recovery. And we want to show our appreciation to the City of Toronto for their financial support towards this worthy endeavor.
While the intention of this podcast is to create an environment of knowledge sharing, positive affirmations, and space for joy, some content may be emotionally triggering and of a sensitive nature. This podcast will feature content related to issues related to mental health in the Black community, which may be emotionally triggering for some. If you or someone you know is triggered by this content or is experiencing a mental health concern, including having thoughts of suicide, support is available. Immediate support is accessible by calling 211 or 1-855-310-2673. You can speak with a crisis worker at any time. Children and youth can also access telephone support 24/7 by contacting the Black Youth Helpline at 416-285-9944. For immediate emergency support, please call 911. All services are free and can be accessed confidentially.
Good afternoon, and welcome to another podcast in our series titled Past, Present, and Future Perspectives on Mental Health in the Black Community. This initiative, which started in March, has consisted of podcasts, forums, and healing circles, which is being broadcast over a 6-month period that seek to expose the negative stigma associated with mental health, encourage open and honest discussions among men, women, and youth, and also provide tangible solutions towards healing and recovery. And here at C Center for Young Black Professionals, we want to give a thank you to the City of Toronto for their support towards this worthy initiative. I'm your host, Richard Lambie, and it is a pleasure to welcome you to this session. Today's podcast is titled Unlocking the Chains of the Past, Self-Esteem, Health Outcomes, and Internalized Oppression. In this podcast, we focus on post-traumatic slave syndrome developed by Joy DeGruy and how it can lead to destructive and harmful impacts that have impacted the social mobility of the Black community and racial separation. We will also discuss how the chains of slavery and looking at race and belonging has produced and encouraged negative self-esteem, poor health outcomes, and internalized oppression. With me to discuss this all-important issue is my friend Kofi Morris. Kofi is a freedom and alignment coach focused in the areas of holistic health and wellness, wealth building, and healthy relationships. He also serves as an ancestral healer, utilizing energy healing and plant-based medicine, and is the founder of Cosmic Wellness Holistic Health. In addition, Kofi volunteers much of his time working with youth, sharing his skills and experiences with community groups around the world, including in North America, South America, the Caribbean, and on the African continent. Kofi is also a founder of Lions and Cubs, a nonprofit organization for young men, which focuses on leadership and self-empowerment. And he is also the current executive director of Wisdom Green Earth, a nonprofit organization committed to using the arts and nature to positively impact the lives of the community. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you for having me, and thank you, C, for creating this space and such a needed space for the community, and especially in this time. we were recently just talking about the impacts of the pandemic in the last 3 years, and being able to share a space like this is so important for the state of our community presently and even pre-pandemic.
Absolutely. Absolutely agree. So before we started the recording, Kofi, we spoke about your book, and I thought that was an excellent starting point into this discussion, because I think it is so relevant to what we're about to talk about. So I'm going to ask you if you could start by talking about your book and how it can help people.
Absolutely. So Change Your Life from the Inside Out, Holistic Habit Success Guide, Volume 1, was released in December 2020. And the book essentially is a guidebook of healing, empowerment, and perseverance to address modern day challenges and to access holistic tools to improve our health and well-being. So why it's so important to address things holistically is with the traditional lens, or what we could also call the indigenous lens. We look at, as a community, we look at ourselves as connected, mentally, emotionally, physically, and spiritually. We look at the 4 different elements and aspects of self as we're navigating identity, as we're navigating and understanding our culture, as opposed to looking at it from one frame and from one lens. Now, when it comes to post-traumatic slave syndrome, which again is a term coined by internationally renowned researcher, Dr. Joy DeGruy, which basically speaks to the multi-generational trauma and injustices that are experienced by people of African descent. In order to look at that, we have to look at the various elements and aspects of our condition. And in this book, I explored the various ways, and again, indigenous and traditional ways, and also modern. I mix it there as well, of how we look at holistic health and how we look at healing and transformation, and the importance of utilizing that information for empowerment as opposed to oppression.
Thank you, Kofi. So I did want to ask you to clarify. Now, you mentioned indigenous, right? I think it's a very important concept to explore, and the importance of indigenous health, and just indigenous ways of thought, and tying that with a holistic way of being. Could you explain that a little bit more for our listeners?
Absolutely. So I know the term has been utilized a lot in the present day, and it's often used more specific to our brothers and sisters of the First Nations. We also recognize that what indigenous speaks to, even if you look up the definition, right, originating or occurring naturally in a particular place, native to a place, original, first, initial, ancient, primordial, etc. Who else does that term speak to? That term speaks to people of African descent. It speaks to people that research has shown as the origin of civilization, right? Started on the continent of Africa. So I identify with that term indigenous as a result of being the descendants and being one of the descendants of people of African descent.
Okay, great. That's thank you very much for that explanation. Now, in terms of the impact of post-traumatic slave syndrome, how do you feel that it has impacted the everyday lives of the mental health of people in the Black community? Let's really break this down here, because there is certainly the belief out there that this has happened so long ago, slavery. It was, no one's going to disagree that it wasn't a terrible well, I don't even want to use the word event. It was a terrible time in world history, a long time and a terrible time. But it was so long ago. How could it possibly affect the community now?
Great question. So, looking at the impact and the journey of our ancestors in even coming and coming as a group of us as and a significant part of the population being brought here as the enslaved, we have to recognize, and Dr. Joy Leary speaks about this, Dr. Joy DeGrasse speaks about this in her book, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, the impact of being displaced, the impact of being taken from a land of origin and being raped of your culture, which includes your language, your spirituality, right? Your identity tying into all of those elements and aspects, right? The way in which you express your culture, and whether that's the food, the traditional foods that you eat, the music that comes, music, the music that originates, that comes from your culture, which includes the instrumentation, the folk stories. All of these things are specific to our experience as people of African descent. Now, you can look at the average person. If you just stop the average person on the street, someone that looks like me and you, someone of African descent, and you ask them to speak Twi, you ask them to speak Kosa, you ask them to speak Kiswahili. Could your average person do that? Most likely not, right? Now, in the eyes of others, these languages are not of high relevance because they just see us as being Black. Regardless of those examples that I just gave, particular languages, particular cultures from west to east to South Africa, we're looked at as the same. However, within, we know that we're not a homogenized group of people. We're not monolithic. But that being said, tying that back to understanding why that's even important is because once those things are taken from you, you're now seeking an understanding of who you are. And what you're going to do eventually is identify with the predominant culture for survival. And this is what we've done. So the lack of identity has led to the things that we face today that are the negative stereotypes that are depicted about us in the media. Violence, right? Broken families, right? Fatherless homes, single mothers, right? The death rate. The list goes on. All of these are symptoms of the impact of our displacement, right? From our culture, from our ways of being, our ways of knowing, from our language. What we do is we find ways, as we are as African people, we are extremely resilient. So we find ways to make do with what we have access to. But it doesn't mean that it's not impacting us on levels, far beyond what could even be understood.
So what I'm getting from what you just said is that if the language was still intact, the learnings over generations could stay with you despite any of the challenges that you face. But without the language, there's no way to continue that on. So there's sort of a break in how things are understood from the past, from that family's specific past, from that tribe. And then by doing that, you're left with nothing. You have to go and find, because you can't have nothing. You have to go and find what your culture is. Is that what you're saying?
100%. And the thing about that is unfortunately a lot of us have not done so. A lot of us have not gone back to try to find. I will say the vast majority of our people um, in the present day have not gone back outside from. So I give an example. Um, these the ancestry um, reclamations. Going back to do research and paying some of these institutes to find out where some of our roots lie. But outside from that, and again, your average person, that's not something that they're normally going to do, nor have they been taught to do that. So we're most likely navigating life in such a way to say, well, these are the things that I like. These are the things that speak to me relative to food, aspects of culture, religious applications, or spirituality, etc. We're in most cases, identifying with Eurocentric views and ways of being of all of the above. And this ranges from birth to death, right? The manner in which we go about naming our children, right? The manner in which we go about, ceremonializing. What is the ceremonies that tie into birth, right? What is ceremonies and the practices that tie into our first rites of passage as young people? See, traditionally, we would name our children names that tie back into our culture. So, from a West African perspective, for example, the Akan tradition, they have day names. So each day of the week, there's a name that is identifiable within the culture. And then there's particular personas or personality types, in a sense, and examples that attach or that are connected to that specific day of the week. Now, in the West, this could also be looked upon as how astrology is approached and stuff like that, right? Which is essentially just a connection of understanding place, time, and its impact on our actual personality development, who we are, etc. Our ancestors went about having ways that we would be able to document our journey. And we saw over thousands of years the examples of how this tied into our personality types. So my name is Kofi. I was renamed. I went through a African-centered rites of passage process. And when I went through that process, I had gone through a naming ceremony in addition to, at the time it was 7 other members, right, from the African community here in Toronto, Canada. So we all received our day names. Now this culturally identifies us. So when I go in community and I introduce myself, one of the first things people ask is, are you Ghanaian? Right? Are you from Ghana? Right? Why? It's because that name connects to a particular region of the planet, right? And I could go on, right? Ekua, Afua, all these different names are day names. So that's just one aspect, but I'm drawing reference to it to say that this is the way in which we create and we cultivate a sense of indigenous connection to community, right? And we can go down the line to speak about marriage rights. So when you complete puberty rights, which is usually 12, 13, 14, right? This is what determines you coming into your young adulthood and community. That process, right? There's a process to that. In the West, we say, okay, you're 18, and all of a sudden you're an adult. But I guarantee that many adults that may be 18 or young people that are 18 that may not function the way you would think an adult is supposed to function. They're not prepared to function as a result in the society that we're in. Why? They haven't gone through any process that would determine that. They haven't been, what we would say in the traditional rites of passage, they have not been separated from their community to go through a process, right, of adult maturation, which is a series of experiences, mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual, that allow for one to be able to transition from child to adult. You would then go through a process of transformation. Throughout that process, you'd then be welcomed back into your community, and you would then be looked upon because you completed this process. And it doesn't end there, but because you completed that process, you can now be looked upon as being a mature individual that can now enter back into the community as an adult. We've removed ourselves, like a lot of those processes have been removed from our culture based upon this separation from our original ways of being. So as a result, we've taken on Eurocentric ways. So we name our children Eurocentric names. When our children go through, whether it's marriage or what have you, it's usually done in the Western sense, right? And then we go forward from that as we become elders. When we go into our eldership process, it's the same thing. Now, the unfortunate thing a lot of the time in the West is Westerners tend to put their parents, or what we would look at as our elders, they put them in seniors' homes, right? That's literally what they do. That has become the practice in the West, unfortunately, right? Now, from the indigenous standpoint, what do? We actually ensure that our parents and our elders, right, play a particular role in our community. Why? They have the wisdom. They've gone through experiences of maturity, and they've gotten to a place in their eldership, but they can actually impart a lot of that wisdom to our younger ones. So why would we put them off into seniors' homes and separate them from the community? So even that, we're going to get a little bit later into the mental health impacts, but even that is another aspect of the displacement of segments of our community, which leads to further results, further symptoms of mental health, right? I'll stop there.
Well, you've touched on so many things there. It is a perfect segue into the whole concept of internalized oppression. I think you made an excellent case. You kind of identified the various elements that make up internalized oppression. Not being connected to family as long as necessary, not being able to learn from your elders as you should, which is something that is definitely noticed in other communities. Now, I wanted to ask you to sort of expand a little bit more, and I mean, you've really touched on it, but how can internalized oppression affect our community? Help us to see where the community is right now, and where and how internalized oppression can help us to understand where things are right now in our community.
Absolutely. So one of the things that we have faced as a result of this, this internalized oppression, is a lack of knowledge of self, right? And what does that do? The impacts of lack of knowing thyself and knowing where you come from, it kind of speaks to one of the things I mentioned earlier, which is an identification with a foreign culture, right? An identification with a foreign way of being. And as a result, we're taking on some of the behaviors, the ways of thinking, the beliefs, and the practices of those who've actually oppressed us, right? Of those who've actually put us in the position, or the predominant culture that has put us in the position of being of a lower economic status, right? Of being, so now what does that look like? Well, here in Toronto, we have a population of our people that are often what the displacement looks like oftentimes in our community is that we are in low income neighborhoods. So not only are we living in low income neighborhoods, a large percentage of us, we're also in circumstances where we have lack of access to resources, right? Now, what does that look like? That specifically translates to poor health, poor diet, poor exercise, right? Access to resources oftentimes can look like higher costs for things that should be, more readily available at a cost that would be affordable for one, right? A lot of the lower income neighborhoods we see are not situated close to grocery stores, for example, where you can get fresh produce, right? So what does that mean? That means a lot of the food that we're eating are foods that are not necessarily natural to our environment. So now you look at things from a, how can I put it? Looking at things from a historical lens, if a large percentage of our community are coming from abroad, so we're coming from the Caribbean, coming from the continent of Africa, etc. Now, in those environments, we were in spaces and places where we can pick and grow our food. Now you're coming to an environment, coming to a climate where you're buying your food in the store, and not only you're buying it in the store, but it's packaged or it's processed. So now what does that look like? Now we know that there's high percentages of diabetes in our community, high cholesterol in our community, obesity, and the list goes on, right? That is specifically tied to lack of exercise, poor diet, poor choices, and access to healthy food. And as a result, you look at that literally generationally. So we're already coming from a space of, there's a connection between the enslavement process, and some of our elders have spoken about this, and disease, right? So the process that our ancestors went through via the slave trade process led us to a scenario whereby the dietary aspects that we chose as a result of lack of access at the time had been passed down through our blood, literally passed down through our DNA. So there's actual venereal diseases that we've inherited through our blood that creates us to be more susceptible, right, to particular diseases in our community, right? Now, how does that look and how does that translate? When a community goes through things like this, you would think, okay, well, now that we know that these are some of the problems, well, then we can just address them, right? We can just go through, we can go to, programs in the community. We can access resources that can speak to some of these issues now that we've identified what they are. No, because now you have lack of access to some of these resources that I've spoken to. However, the negative choices are readily available to you, right? So we have, the liquor stores and it's much worse in the United States. But just speaking to Canada, you have the chicken and chips, locations spread out, through our community. Like I said, there's lack of the grocery stores close, but you'll definitely find a fried chicken, spot in our communities, right? You'll find these convenience stores that are selling, the chips and the pop and all of these things that our young people are often, it's cheaper to buy those types of foods, right, than it is to buy groceries that may be healthy for us. And it's actually hard to find because you have to travel quite a distance to access those foods. So some of the internalized oppression looks like lack of access to resources, poor mental and physical health, which ties specifically back to all of what I've just kind of described. And then this aspect around how we look at ourselves, right? Do we love ourselves as we are? The way in which our hair grows out of our head, the thickness of our lips, thickness of our nose, right? All of these things, we're in a society where some of these things are looked down upon or they're frowned upon in particular ways. They're not boosted as being positive forms or views of beauty, right? What we're often fed is the long hair, blue eyes, blonde hair, etc., as being, the epitome of beauty in our community, right? Unfortunately. And as a result, that causes us to look at ourselves and compare ourselves to those commercials, to those views of what we've seen. There's a test that is called the doll test. I forget the name of it. The name of it's going to come.
I've heard of it. Yes.
Right. But it's specifically, it's literally called the doll test. And it speaks to examples that were given to children. This is 1940, psychological experiment designed in the 1940s, and it tested the degree of marginalization felt by African American children caused by prejudice, discrimination, and racial segregation. They gave them two dolls, and they gave them a white doll, right, European doll, and a black doll, right, a child of African, a doll of African descent. And they asked the children, which doll is the nice doll, which doll is the pretty doll, and they went down the line. And those children chose the European dolls time and time again in various tests. That was the intelligent doll, that was the nice doll, that was the pretty doll, and the list went on. Now you might be thinking, how is this relevant? Why is that important? Well, think about it. If that's the thinking and the outlook of young children, what happens as we grow up into our adolescence and we grow up to being young adults and then adults? We're going to be looking at ourselves as a community in these negative ways and constantly looking at the white community, European community, as being the epitome of intelligence, beauty, and the list goes on. Everything positive. White is positive, black is negative, right? So all of these things become internalized. And then as a result, we want to know, well, why are the numbers in terms of our the divorce rates so high? Why are the numbers of young people, let's say, not even marrying, not even seeking partnerships, right? A lot of the things that have been told to us, taught to us, have been negative. So now, as a result, we've internalized that and we live that reality, right? So you asked about some of the positive. I think you had asked about the positive elements.
Well, what I was going to say, I was going to ask you, and you started to touch on it, identity and culture for the African Canadian, whether they have recently arrived here, whether they've been here for generations. You've really kind of laid out, elements of identity and culture, and some of the factors that can affect that. Now, in your experience working with men, women, youth in the Black community, how do you think that we are seeing each other?
So how we're seeing each other presently oftentimes is from a deficit place. And what I mean by that is sometimes even how we approach our relationships, the thinking and the thought is, so let me actually backtrack. Let me look at, again, the divorce rate, separation rate in our community. In many rooms that I'm in, I'll ask how many people grew up with their father, right? In the room, people put up their hands. How many people grew up with their father present in their home? Another group of people. Now, if we are to look at that and fast forward to our relationships, thinking and moving from a place of understanding that, okay, I didn't grow up with a dad in my home. And now I'm going out into the community, and that's the reality for a lot of the people in my community. There's almost an expectation that there's a potential that children are going to grow up in single mother parent households as a result of our own lived experience. Now, some people can say, well, no, it's not always the case and whatever. And I'm not speaking about always, but I'm speaking about the percentage. And there's reasons for this, right? I don't want to just speak to it and for it to be one-sided, but there's reasons for this. And we're in a society of which rewards mothers when there's not a man in the home. And this goes back, right, in terms of from a historical perspective, that once you're receiving, let's say you're low income, let's just say you just moved to the country, you're looking for work, right? Or you're going to school, you're a student, whatever the case may be. And especially in Toronto, if you're not in a space to be able to afford that rent, you may actually seek social assistance. Now, that social assistance check is higher when you're in an environment, in a household that does not have two parents. So the fact that there's one parent in the household, or at least if it looks like that on the books, you're going to receive more money to be able to sustain yourself monthly. What had happened with that historically is that even in some cases where the mother was with the father, right, it became more advantageous to say that he was not in the home so they could get more in the check so that more funds could be allocated monthly for the needs of the family, needs of the children. What did that do? Well, fast forward to the reality around proving that there isn't a man in the home, there isn't a father in the home. So now the father becomes displaced because he either has to pretend that he doesn't live there, right? Or the two, what it does is it challenges the relationship. Because let's just say he's in a similar situation where he may be working part-time, or he's going to school, right? What's the chance? There's a higher chance, and what has happened is the single mother, started to benefit more financially from not from reporting to the government that they were a single parent household. More funds were coming into the home, father's not around, so now the state, right, in this case, or the government, is providing the funding, right, that supports the home as opposed to the father. And this has gone on for years and years and years. So now, as a result, what does that look like for our community? Well, it looks like, again, single mother households. And the more children that are born into that family, the more checks from the government, right? So that's just one element or one aspect of what it looks like. And the ability for us to address that, or to look at that from a standpoint of, okay, how do we address that from even going back from a teenage pregnancy standpoint? Because when those young people that are born into that family become of age, and the same type of cycle continues, right? Whereby there's a teenage pregnancy scenario, that young mother has now been brought up in an environment where it actually has been affirmed for her that if she can't afford it, she can now get those funds from the government. However, she has already been taught, or she's already been shown that if she reports to the government that the father is not in the household, that's an additional income, right? Source of income that can come in. So now this now can happen generationally, and that's what we've actually seen. Likewise, the young man who potentially is the father of that child, right? He has potentially also seen from either his father or the other fathers in the community that this is the scenario where if you get, your girlfriend, your partner, etc., pregnant, right? There's a high chance that if you show that you don't live there, right, then there could be more income generated for the household. So now he stays away. So now it becomes a generational issue now, right, of displacement, a generational issue of separation between mother and father. So now we go down the line with that, and we see that there is this lack of healthy communication, co-parenting taking place, because the government has stepped in and provided funding in a space whereby the father would be able to be in a space where that's also part of his rites of passage as a young man, right? Him becoming a father provides the opportunity for him to be able to go and ensure that he has the income that he can support that family. But now you take that away, right? Or you replace it with him doing something else, him doing something illegal, for example, to be able to provide for his family, because he's now competing with this government check. So he's saying, you know what, don't take the check. I can make the money. Okay, you're young. You don't have a quality education as of yet, for example, or you don't have an income based upon lack of employment, which ties back to education, for example. So what are you going to do? Well, you may now choose to do something illegal to be able to provide for that young family that you have. That in itself is also a cycle that is continued, where we have generations of young men that are incarcerated, that go to the prison system, the correctional system, and meet their uncles and their father and these people, right? These older males. And that has become a rites of passage in our community. So now young people are saying, You've never been locked up? What do you mean? That has become a rites of passage as opposed to rites of passage that we had traditionally, right? That was a healthy adult maturation process guided by elders. You now have rites of passage that has to do with getting a woman, getting a girl pregnant, dropping out of school, your first weapon, your first pistol, or whatever the case may be, and getting incarcerated. Those are the rites of passage now, negative forms of rites of passage that have taken precedent now over the healthy forms of rites of passage, which would be you learning aspects and elements of your culture, learning how to cook, learning how to provide, knowing how to sew, learning how to wash your clothes, take care of your body, personal hygiene, learning. Traditionally, it would be learning how to hunt, but I'm giving examples in a North American environment, which could be something like learning how to cook, right? These are the things that you would learn in traditional forms of rites of passage. They have now been replaced with these negative forms. And socially, in that peer group, you're actually respected more for those things. A young man, Chris Rock has a comedy where he speaks about a young man graduating from college or university, and he comes back to his neighborhood and he announces it to his friends and peers, and they look at him like, oh, what do you think, you're smarter than us now? However, a young man can be released from prison, released from jail, and they throw him a party, right? They welcome him back with a party and celebration. So there's some issues there, because we're prioritizing these negative behaviors and ways of being over something that actually is sustainable for our community, right? That opens up doors and can open up doors relative to the education standpoint, which can address the low economic bracket, which can address the low income factors that we're faced with in our community, right? The dropout rates of school. Right? I was looking up some stats, and the dropout rates for Black students is 23% compared to 12% for white students, right? So these things have continued as patterns of behavior in our community that all speak back to the question that you asked, which is the oppressive aspect. And there's a lack of connection to post-secondary education, because the generation before you, for example, may not have finished their post-secondary. Maybe they just completed their high school. Where are the examples of individuals that have pursued post-secondary education that can come back and say, hey, you know what, you should get into college. You should get into university. No, there are other examples that are negative that a lot of our young people have taken on.
So this is just incredible. Like, I mean, you have sort of laid out the intergenerational struggle that is faced by many persons in the Black community. And the one thought that I had as well is how you very succinctly demonstrated that without that initial culture in the first place, it will be filled in by something else. So if that way of living, that way of being passed down from generations isn't there, something will fill its place. And based on economic conditions, social conditions, it will end up being filled, I suppose, because as human beings, we don't run around as an empty vessel. We are going to fill it with something, whether it's good or it's bad. Now, I really, I don't want to end on this note, although this is without question a daunting task. I think we both can agree that despite everything that we have seen out there, that we have been through, that we have gone through, that we're going through, that we're extremely resilient, that we're a very resilient people. How should we look at the future? What can we do to move things forward? You did mention that despite these challenges, that there is a positive element that we can take from PTSS and just from these issues that are there? How can we move forward in a more hopeful light?
Great question. So going back to what you just shared in terms of our resiliency, historically, we've often, made lemonade from lemons. And what I mean by that is, even traditionally, when we're given something, we turn it into something else. Our ability to be able to be creative, even in terms of how we approach our culture, how we approach our forms of dress, how we approach our musical expression, things of that nature, have been used to be able to sustain us, has been used to celebrate our culture. So Carnival, right, which started in the Caribbean, roots in Trinidad and Tobago, and South America, Brazil, etc. Carnival and Caravana is another name here, Toronto, Canada, is the celebration of our ancestors coming out of the enslavement process. We utilize this as a form of celebration. It had now, the last couple of years, become the largest celebration across North America, from my understanding, right? This Caravana celebration, which originated from the enslavement process and us liberating ourselves from the enslavement process, right? So why is that relevant? Why is that important? It's another example of how we take something that's negative and we turn it into a positive. And it has now become a huge, economic opportunity for companies and even governments here in Toronto, Canada. That's just one aspect of our culture that we've taken and transformed. So it's incumbent for us to continue to utilize our culture for upliftment, to utilize our way of being and understanding ourselves as Indigenous beings, that we have this ability to transform our environment to our benefit. We have the ability to take what we have and build from it. So the way in which we can empower our children is to ensure that we're breaking those chains of oppression, even in our language and how we speak and empower our children, right? The manner in which we discipline our children, the manner in which we expose them to information and education that can help to empower them. These are ways that we can actually approach our situation and allow it to become better. We can look at our relationships and the manner in which we embrace traditional ways of being in our relationships. What are some of the cultural practices that we have that we can utilize relative to forming relationships? Well, rites of passage, once again, comes into play, right? We want to come from a place of acknowledging that indigenously, traditionally, this is what we would do at the birth of a child. Going back to naming ceremonies, acknowledging that we're giving our children names that are empowering, giving our children names that tie back to our culture and understanding. And it doesn't always mean that it's only, for example, just choosing an African name. You could choose a name for your child that ties back into your ancestry, which is someone from your family line, perhaps, that embodied particular principles and ways of being and character that you wish for this child that's coming into the world to be able to cultivate as they get older. And then you are experiencing and expressing to them their origin, their story. Why did you name them that? As they get older, those are questions, comments, conversations that you can have with your children. We wanted to name you this so that we were empowering your life so that you would embody or have the opportunity to embody some of these traits of your great, great grand uncle, father, mother, etc. Right? So naming our children, going through processes and ceremonies where we welcome members of the community to that naming ceremony, and we allow others to be a part of that child's future. And we allow those people to commit verbally to the life of that child, what it is that they're going to cultivate and bring in and provide to that child. Very similar to our ceremonies that have to do with how we cultivate marriage and engagements. We can utilize, again, these traditional ways of what we call, for example, a tasting, right? A tasting. This is a traditional or ceremonial way of um, introducing this couple to community, but giving them a process that's going to show them and allow them to understand that there's going to be different opportunities that are going to come in their relationship, and we want to provide a way to be able to show them that these ways, or these symbolic ways of looking at relationships, are going to come up in their relationship. So we want to provide a framework to show them that we're here to support their process that they may experience going into this relationship. So we have a tasting, right? There's different various tastes, right? Honeys represents sweet, right? And it goes down the line, right? Bitter, salty, spicy. Like, these are the different areas. Now, these are symbolic gestures that are utilized, and two people are going through the marriage process that are symbolic and metaphoric to say to them that life is going to have moments where it's bitter. We're empowering you to say that even in those times, pull together, stay together, maintain the family unit. We're here as a community to support you through those moments. There's also times that life is going to be sweet. Enjoy and celebrate those times. We're going to be here to celebrate you throughout those moments. These are all symbolic, but these are also happening in the midst of in a traditional setting, in a sense, in the midst of members of community that are affirming these things to be truthful. We're doing them in such a way that we're acknowledging the ancestors and their role in our families and community of being able to cultivate healthy traits and ways of being. So these are things that we can do that have been done traditionally to support the next stages and phases of our evolution as an African community. You go into our eldership. What are the ways that we can celebrate our elders, bringing them into the family, allow them to play particular roles in the family, asking for their guidance and their wisdom, allowing them to be part of these ceremonies, allowing them to speak life into the life of that child at that child's naming ceremony, the life of that relationship and those two couples, and imparting some wisdom that they can perhaps impart. And even if they're not biological parents to that couple or to that child, you can invite members of the community that can support and speak to those positive traits for that child growing up, for that marriage, for that partnership that's growing up. So this is what allows for our elders to feel like they play a particular role in the community and in the village, and we're giving them a space that's not just putting them off to the side. Again, in a senior's home, we allow them to actually feel connected to community and feel as though that they have a purpose. This also supports their positive mental health, right? These are traits. This is part of their purpose as elders, is to pass on that wisdom and also speak to some of the challenges that maybe they faced growing up and some ways that those challenges can be overcome, or to understand, to look out for the pitfalls and the decisions that maybe they made that were not healthy, that they have now learned and they can now impart to the next generation so that they don't have to take and make the same mistakes, right? These are some of the concrete, very tangible ways that we can address some of this, again, the internalized oppression that has taken place in our community by going back to indigenous ways of being and being able to cultivate these ceremonial ways, metaphoric approaches, right? To be able to cultivate a better and brighter future for our children. So all of that is to say that we're providing a framework that our ancestors have left behind that we can utilize to incorporate and to encourage our everything from our young children all the way up to our elders, so that we can paint a different picture and create a different future that's empowering for our people, and that creates a different framework and narrative that we can now look at ourselves from that light.
That was so well said. I couldn't. It couldn't be said any better. I want to thank you so much. Again, everyone, we're speaking with Kofi Morris, founder of Cosmic Wellness, Holistic Health and Well-Being, and also author of the book Change Your Life. I really appreciate you taking the time to go through this with us, because in my opinion, you connected the dots. You showed us why it's important to connect back to our roots in Africa. Yes, you could go back to in areas such as the Caribbean, because there is a culture there that has developed. But nonetheless, history is far more rich and broad if you connect back to our ancestral roots in Africa. And a lot of people listening to this may feel, well, I don't know anything about Africa, and but I think the truth is that I think we all do. We all know Africa in some way, shape, or form. It doesn't necessarily mean that we have to go back there, but to recognize its consistent and constant influence and power on our lives and on the lives of the world. I think it can help to empower us and help to undo the internal oppression that we're facing, and help us to take that first step forward and break that cycle. So again, Kofi, I can't thank you enough. We really want to get this out. All people listening to this podcast, please share it with your family and friends. Let as many people as you know hear about it, and reach out to us. Send us a message. Send us a chat on social media. Give us your thoughts. We want to continue the conversation. It's so important for our community in this day and age. Once again, Kofi, I can't thank you enough. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you for creating the space for us to really share and speak to the empowerment of our community. And again, the positive elements and aspects, but also recognizing that there's areas that we can improve. So I'm thanking you for creating the space and for us to be able to celebrate ourselves and our culture and our history in a very practical way.
And I wish you all the best.
Thank you.